If you've ever wondered how money actually came to exist, not the coins or bills themselves, but the concept, the agreement that certain objects hold value that strangers will accept, the answer reaches back further than you might expect. The story doesn't begin with gold coins or banks. It begins with a problem that humans faced tens of thousands of years ago. How do you exchange value with people you don't know and might never see again? Money is the solution we eventually developed. But understanding how we got there requires going back to when the problem first emerged, to small groups of humans living in a world where trust was personal, memory was the ledger, and debt existed thousands of years before anyone thought to invent currency. For most of human existence, people lived in small groups rarely exceeding 150 individuals. These bands of hunter-gatherers moved through territories they knew intimately, following seasonal patterns of plant growth and animal migration. Everyone knew everyone else. You grew up with the same people you would live with your entire life. In such communities, economic exchange operated on principles entirely different from anything we would recognize as monetary. There were no prices, no currency, no formal accounting. Instead, there was memory, reputation, and reciprocal obligation. When someone in the group made a successful kill, the meat was shared. This wasn't charity or even conscious economic calculation. Sharing valuable resources was simply how things worked. The hunter who brought down a large animal couldn't consume all the meat before it spoiled, and there was no reliable way to preserve it for long periods. Distributing the meat to others in the group made practical sense, but it also created social bonds and expectations. The people who received meat today would be expected to share when they had surplus tomorrow. No one tracked these exchanges with formal records. Social memory served that function. Reputation mattered enormously in these small communities. A person known to share generously when they had abundance would be remembered and reciprocated when others had surplus. Someone who consistently took without giving back would develop a poor reputation, leading others to exclude them from future exchanges. This system worked because everyone could observe everyone else's behavior over time. Cheating was difficult when your actions were visible to the entire community, and when you would continue interacting with the same people for your entire life. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies observe similar patterns. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, successful hunters distribute meat widely through the camp. Among Australian Aboriginal groups, elaborate kinship systems create networks of obligation that ensure resources flow through communities. The San peoples of southern Africa maintain sharing practices that have likely persisted for tens of thousands of years. These aren't primitive systems that failed to develop proper economics. They are sophisticated social technologies adapted to specific circumstances where they work remarkably well. The gift economy operates on principles that seem paradoxical from a modern monetary perspective. Giving creates obligation rather than settling it. When you receive a gift, you incur a debt that should eventually be repaid, though not immediately and not necessarily with equivalent value. The timing is deliberately imprecise, and the return gift might be quite different from what was originally given. This vagueness serves a purpose. It maintains ongoing relationships rather than closing transactions. People remain connected through networks of mutual obligation that extend across time. Debt in this context is not a problem to be eliminated, but a social bond to be maintained. You want to owe people and have people owe you, because these debts create the fabric of social relationships. The anthropologist David Graeber argued that debt is more fundamental than barter, that human societies created elaborate systems of mutual obligation long before anyone thought to exchange goods directly for other goods of equivalent value. The archaeological evidence supports this view. We find evidence of gift exchange and long-distance trade networks extending back tens of thousands of years, but no evidence of pure barter economies. Long-distance trade existed in the Paleolithic period, though not in forms we might immediately recognize as economic exchange. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its ability to hold extremely sharp edges, traveled hundreds of kilometers from source locations. Shells from coastal regions appear in inland sites far from the sea. Ochre, valued for pigment, moved across vast distances. These materials passed through many hands on their journeys. The mechanisms of transfer likely involved gift exchange between groups that met at territorial boundaries, with each group passing goods along to the next group in the chain. The problem with this system appears when you need to exchange value with strangers. Gift exchange works when you have ongoing relationships, when you expect to encounter the same people repeatedly, when reputation matters, and social memory tracks who owes what to whom. But what happens when you meet someone from a distant group, someone you've never seen before and might never see again? How do you trade with them? The old system provides no answer. You cannot rely on future reciprocity from someone you'll never encounter again. You cannot damage their reputation in a community you're not part of. The social mechanisms that make gift exchange work simply don't apply. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans solved this problem through kinship extensions and intermediary relationships. If you encountered a stranger, you might establish a connection through distant relatives or through mutual acquaintances. Many indigenous societies developed elaborate kinship classification systems that could incorporate even distant strangers into relationship categories that came with specific obligations and expectations. The stranger becomes a cousin of a particular type, and that classification determines how you should interact. This worked, but had obvious limitations in scale and geographic reach. Another solution involved creating neutral meeting grounds where different groups could gather for trade under temporary truce conditions. Archaeological sites across the world show evidence of locations that appear to have served this function, places where multiple distinct cultural groups came together, presumably for exchange. These gatherings often coincided with seasonal events like salmon runs or the ripening of important plant resources, times when local abundance could support larger populations temporarily. The social rules governing behavior at these gatherings would have been different from normal interactions, creating temporary frameworks for exchange between groups that might otherwise avoid or fight each other. The cognitive requirements for these systems are substantial. You need to track who gave what to whom. Maintain mental records of debts and obligations. Remember the status and reliability of various individuals, and calculate appropriate reciprocation for gifts received. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers show that people in these societies possess remarkable memories for social information. They can recall specific transactions from years earlier, remember the hunting success rates of various individuals, and maintain detailed knowledge of kinship relationships extending to distant relatives. This cognitive capacity evolved to handle the complexity of gift economies and social exchange. Some form of material tokens probably emerged early as memory aids or symbols of obligation. A simple tally stick with notches could record a debt. A special object given as a gift might serve as a reminder of the obligation created. Here we have limited archaeological evidence for such items from the Paleolithic period, because organic materials rarely survive tens of thousands of years. But later societies around the world independently developed similar systems, suggesting the practice has deep roots. The Inca used knotted strings called quipu to record numerical information, including debts and obligations. Medieval European merchants used tally sticks as receipts. The principle appears universal. The fundamental limitation of pre-monetary exchange is that it requires social relationships. You cannot easily trade with complete strangers. You cannot easily store value across long time periods. You cannot easily exchange unlike goods without social negotiation about appropriate reciprocity. A deer carcass cannot be saved for next year. The person who gave you shells might die before you can reciprocate. The stranger offering beautiful tools wants grain that won't be harvested for months. These problems have no solutions in a pure gift economy. The development of agriculture around 10,000 BCE created conditions that made these limitations increasingly problematic. Settled farming communities grew larger than the 150-person scale, where everyone knows everyone else personally. Agricultural surplus could be stored for extended periods, creating new possibilities and new problems around ownership and distribution. Specialized craftspeople emerged who didn't produce their own food and needed some way to exchange their products for grain and other necessities. The old social technologies for managing exchange started breaking down under new conditions. Interestingly, many agricultural societies initially tried to extend the old gift economy systems rather than inventing something new. Early farming villages in the Near East show evidence of communal grain storage and distribution systems. Archaeologists find large storage facilities that appear to have served entire communities rather than individual households. Leadership in these societies likely involved managing these communal resources, redistributing stored grain according to social rules about who deserved what. This worked for villages of a few hundred people, but became increasingly difficult as communities grew larger. The temple economies that emerged in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE can be understood as attempts to scale up gift economy principles through institutional management. Temples received offerings from the community and redistributed resources back to the community according to complex rules about obligation and reciprocity. The gods became the ultimate gift givers, with priests managing the practical details of exchange. This system required extensive record-keeping, which led to some of the earliest writing, but it still operated on principles of reciprocal obligation rather than market exchange or monetary pricing. We can see the problem that money would eventually solve by imagining a specific scenario. You're a farmer who has harvested more grain than your family needs. A traveling craftsperson arrives with beautiful pottery. You want the pottery. The potter wants grain. But the potter wants only a small amount of grain, much less than the value of the pottery you desire. You have nothing else the potter wants. The potter will continue traveling and you'll never see them again. So future reciprocity isn't an option. In a gift economy, this exchange simply doesn't happen. The incommensurability of the goods and the absence of ongoing relationship make it impossible. You need some way to store the difference in value, some token the potter would accept that could later be exchanged with someone else for something the potter actually needs. Money emerges as the solution to this problem, but not suddenly and not in the forms we might expect. The path from gift economies to monetary exchange involves thousands of years of experimentation and many intermediate steps. Different societies tried different solutions, some of which worked and spread while others failed and were abandoned. Before anyone minted a coin or wrote a number on a clay tablet to represent abstract value, humans had to develop the conceptual framework that would make monetary thinking possible. They needed to accept that value could be represented abstractly, that obligations could be quantified precisely rather than maintained through vague social reciprocity, and that exchange could occur between strangers without ongoing relationships. This cognitive shift was as important as any physical invention of currency, and it took thousands of years to fully develop. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq became the testing ground for solutions to the problems that gift economies could not solve. Mesopotamia developed some of the earliest agricultural settlements, and by 9000 BCE, people were cultivating wheat and barley in quantities that produced substantial surplus. This surplus created possibilities that had never existed before. Food could be stored for months or years. Some people could specialize in activities other than food production. Communities could grow to sizes of thousands rather than hundreds. But surplus also created new problems around ownership, distribution, and accounting that would drive the development of increasingly sophisticated systems for tracking value and obligation. The earliest evidence of accounting in Mesopotamia comes not from writing, but from small clay objects called tokens. These tokens appear in archaeological sites dating back to around 8000 BCE, though they become common by 3500 BCE. The tokens were shaped into specific forms: cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, and more complex shapes. Each shape represented a particular quantity of a particular good. A cone might represent a small measure of grain. A sphere might represent a larger measure. Different shapes corresponded to different commodities including grain, oil, animals, and textiles. These tokens functioned as a physical accounting system. A merchant or temple administrator could use tokens to represent goods that existed elsewhere. If you delivered 10 measures of barley to a temple storehouse, the temple might give you 10 cone-shaped tokens as a receipt. You could later return those tokens to withdraw an equivalent amount of grain. Or you might use the tokens to settle a debt with someone else, who could then redeem them at the temple. The system allowed value to be represented physically and moved separately from the actual goods. The archaeological evidence shows that token systems were used across the Near East for thousands of years with remarkable consistency. The same shapes appear at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggesting standardized meanings that were understood across different communities. This standardization was crucial. For tokens to work as a medium of exchange, people needed to agree on what each shape represented. The agreement must have been maintained through trade networks and cultural contact, creating one of the earliest examples of widespread standardization of value representation. Around 3500 BCE, someone in Mesopotamia developed an innovation that would prove revolutionary. Instead of simply storing tokens loose, they began enclosing them in hollow clay balls called buli. The tokens would be placed inside the bulla, which was then sealed. The outside of the bulla was marked with impressions indicating how many tokens of each type were inside. If the bulla contained 5 cone tokens and 3 sphere tokens, the outside would be marked accordingly. This created a permanent tamper-evident record of the transaction. The bulla system solved a critical problem: verification without breaking the seal. Before bully, if someone claimed to have tokens representing a certain quantity of goods, you had to take their word for it or physically count the tokens. With a bulla, the external markings provided a verifiable record. If there was any dispute, the bulla could be broken open to confirm that the markings matched the contents. Most bullae were never opened, suggesting that the external markings were trusted as accurate. This represents an important conceptual step toward abstract representation of value. The next development happened when scribes realized that the external markings on bullae made the internal tokens redundant. If everyone trusted the marks on the outside, why bother putting actual tokens inside? This led to the creation of solid clay tablets marked with impressions that represented quantities of goods without any tokens involved. These marked tablets appear around 3200 BCE and represent some of the earliest writing. The signs pressed into clay were originally pictographic, with each sign representing a specific commodity. A sign that looked like a grain stalk meant barley. A sign that looked like a jar meant oil. The development of writing from accounting marks was gradual but transformative. Early tablets from Uruk, one of the world's first cities, show increasingly complex notations. Scribes developed signs not just for commodities but for numbers, allowing them to record precise quantities. They created signs for units of measurement, distinguishing between small measures and large measures of the same good. They began recording not just static quantities but transactions, deliveries, disbursements, payments, and debts. The tablets became records of economic activity rather than just representations of stored goods. Temple complexes served as the primary loci of this accounting activity in early Mesopotamian cities. Temples were not just religious institutions but economic centers that collected agricultural surplus in the form of offerings and taxes, stored it in large granaries and warehouses, and redistributed it to support priests, craftspeople, and laborers who worked on temple projects. Managing these flows of goods required extensive record-keeping. Archaeological excavations of temple sites have uncovered thousands of clay tablets recording deliveries of grain, allotments of beer and bread to workers, inventories of livestock, and calculations of what was owed to various individuals. The grain itself functioned as a medium of exchange in these early economies, though not quite as money in the modern sense. Barley was the primary crop and the standard unit for measuring value. Prices for other goods were often expressed in grain equivalents. A tool might be worth 10 measures of barley. A day's labour might earn 3 measures of barley. The temple might pay workers in actual barley, or might give them clay tablets recording a credit of barley that could be redeemed later or transferred to someone else to settle a debt. This created a system where grain served as both commodity and unit of account. Using grain as money had obvious limitations. Grain is bulky and heavy, making large transactions physically impractical. It spoils over time if not properly stored, preventing long-term value storage. Its value fluctuates with harvest quality, creating instability. A measure of barley after a good harvest is worth less than the same measure after a poor harvest. Yet the tablets recording grain credits might not reflect this variation. These problems would eventually drive the shift toward more stable and portable value representations. But for centuries, grain remained the primary reference point for economic calculation. Silver emerged as an alternative to grain for representing value, appearing in Mesopotamian records by 3000 BCE. Unlike grain, silver doesn't spoil. It's valuable in small quantities, so significant value can be represented in portable form. It can be divided into smaller pieces or combined into larger pieces without losing value. The metal itself has intrinsic worth for making jewellery and decorative objects. These properties made silver superior to grain for many economic purposes, though the transition happened gradually over centuries, rather than suddenly replacing the grain-based system. The shekel emerged as a unit of account before it became a physical coin. A shekel originally was a unit of weight, roughly 8.4 grams of silver. Prices began to be quoted in shekels even though no standardized silver pieces of that weight existed. Instead, silver was weighed out for each transaction using balance scales. A merchant selling pottery might ask for 2 shekels worth of silver. The buyer would bring silver fragments or pieces that would be weighed on scales until they totaled approximately 2 shekels. The lack of standardization meant that every significant transaction required weighing, and often negotiation about purity. The purity problem was substantial. Silver in ancient Mesopotamia was never pure but always alloyed with varying amounts of other metals, particularly copper and lead. Pure silver is soft and difficult to produce with ancient metallurgical techniques, but the more copper or lead mixed into the silver, the less valuable it becomes. Here, this created opportunities for fraud. A dishonest merchant might pass off heavily debased silver as purer metal, without sophisticated testing methods, determining the exact purity required expertise and trust. This problem would eventually contribute to the development of coinage, where a trusted authority would guarantee both weight and purity with a stamped seal. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1750 BCE, provides detailed insight into how Mesopotamian societies regulated economic relationships in this pre-coinage period. The code is famous for its eye for an eye provisions, but much of it deals with economic matters: interest rates on loans, obligations of debtors, penalties for fraud, rules about agricultural tenancy, and wage rates for various types of labour. The code specifies that interest on barley loans should not exceed 33% per year, while interest on silver loans should not exceed 20%. These provisions indicate that lending at interest was common and that authorities felt the need to regulate it. Debt in Hammurabi's code is treated as a serious matter with severe consequences for default. A person who could not repay debts might have to give up family members as debt slaves, with the code specifying that such slavery should last no more than 3 years. Debts were inheritable, passing to children if the original debtor died without repaying. The code also includes provisions for debt cancellation in certain circumstances, suggesting that debt accumulation could become socially destabilizing if allowed to continue unchecked. Later, Mesopotamian kings would occasionally decree general debt cancellations to prevent economic collapse from excessive debt burdens. The sophistication of Mesopotamian accounting is evident in mathematical tablets that have survived from this period. Scribes developed tables for calculating compound interest, determining the time required for investments to double at various interest rates, and solving complex problems involving multiple transactions. They used base 60 mathematics, which we still employ today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. The mathematical knowledge required to manage temple economies and large-scale trade was substantial, and scribal training took years of study to master the necessary skills. Trade networks extended Mesopotamian economic influence far beyond the river valleys. Merchants travelled to Anatolia to obtain tin and copper for bronze production. They imported timber from the Levant, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and carnelian from the Indus Valley. These long-distance trades required credit systems and deferred payment arrangements. A merchant might take goods on credit from a temple or wealthy individual, travel for months to distant regions, trade the goods for other commodities, and return to settle accounts. Records of these arrangements appear on clay tablets, showing the development of increasingly sophisticated financial instruments. By 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian societies had developed accounting systems, units of account, credit arrangements, interest-bearing loans, and methods for representing value in both grain and silver. They had created economic institutions that could manage complex flows of goods across time and space. What they had not yet created was standardized currency. The silver used in transactions came in irregular pieces that had to be weighed for each exchange. The grain credits recorded on tablets could be transferred, but lacked universal acceptance. The next major development would come from the western edge of Mesopotamia's trading world, where a small kingdom would solve the standardization problem by creating the first true coins. But that innovation would not arrive for another 2,000 years. In the meantime, Mesopotamian accounting systems spread throughout the Near East, creating the foundation for economic complexity that would eventually require coinage to reach its full potential. around 600 BCE in the Kingdom of Lydia. Located in what is now Western Turkey, someone made a discovery that would transform how humans exchanged value. The Lydians began producing small pieces of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, stamped with official marks guaranteeing their weight and purity. These stamped pieces were the world's first true coins. The innovation seems simple in retrospect, but it solved problems that had plagued commerce for thousands of years. No longer did every transaction require weighing metal and assessing purity. The stamp of the Lydian king certified both, allowing coins to pass from hand to hand without verification. Trust in the issuing authority replaced the need to trust individual merchants. Electrum was particularly abundant in Lydia, found in rivers flowing from the mountains. The natural alloy appeared in varying proportions of gold to silver, but Lydian metalworkers learned to standardize it to consistent ratios. Early Lydian coins were small bean-shaped pieces, stamped on one side with parallel grooves and on the other with a lion's head, the symbol of the Lydian royal house. The weight was standardized to specific units, with larger coins worth precise multiples of smaller ones. A stater, the standard large coin, weighed about 14 grams. Smaller denominations allowed for transactions of varying sizes. The genius of coinage lay not in the metal itself, but in the guarantee. For thousands of years, people had used precious metals as value stores, but every transaction required verification. Merchants carried scales. Disputes arose about weight and purity. Transactions took time and required expertise. Lydian coins eliminated these frictions. The royal stamp meant you could accept the coin at face value without testing it. This dramatically reduced transaction costs and made commerce more efficient. A merchant could quickly count coins rather than carefully weighing metal. A customer could trust that coins received as change were worth what they claimed to be. The innovation spread rapidly. By 550 BCE, the Persian Empire, which had conquered Lydia, began minting its own coins. The Persian daric, a gold coin weighing about 8.4 grams, became one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world. Greek city-states began producing coins around the same time, each with distinctive imagery reflecting local culture and civic pride. Athens minted coins with an owl, sacred to the goddess Athena. Corinth used the winged horse Pegasus. These images served as brands, making coins from different mints immediately identifiable and allowing people to develop preferences based on a city's reputation for honest coinage. China independently invented coinage around the same period, though the Chinese approach differed substantially from the Mediterranean model. Chinese coins were made from bronze rather than precious metals. They were cast in molds rather than struck with hammers. Many early Chinese coins were shaped like miniature tools, tiny spades or knives, suggesting they evolved from actual tool money where small implements served as standardized exchange media. By the Qin dynasty around 200 BCE, China had standardized on round coins with square holes in the center, a design that would persist for over 2,000 years. The Greek world saw an explosion of coinage innovation between 500 and 300 BCE. Hundreds of city-states and kingdoms minted their own coins, creating a bewildering variety of standards, weights, and designs. This diversity reflected political fragmentation, but also revealed the power of coinage to assert sovereignty. Minting coins was a prerogative of political authority. The images and inscriptions on coins proclaimed who ruled, what gods they honoured, and what achievements they celebrated. Coins became miniature declarations of political legitimacy and civic identity. Coinage enabled new forms of economic activity. Markets expanded because transactions became easier. Merchants could trade with strangers more readily because coins provided a universally recognized medium of exchange. Soldiers could be paid in coins that they could spend anywhere, making it possible to maintain large standing armies far from home. Workers could be hired for wages paid in coin rather than in kind. The money economy began to penetrate aspects of life that had previously operated through barter, gift exchange, or traditional obligations. However, coinage also created new forms of inequality and social tension. In societies where land and obligations had determined status, sudden access to coined money allowed some people to accumulate wealth in portable, storable form. Debt became more precisely quantified. a vague obligation to repay a favour transformed into a specific number of coins owed by a specific date. Default had clearer consequences. The ability to accumulate coins created new distinctions between rich and poor that didn't necessarily correspond to traditional status hierarchies. Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, worried about the social effects of monetary wealth and debated whether charging interest on loans was morally acceptable. Governments discovered that controlling coinage provided new sources of revenue and new tools for managing economies. A king could profit from minting coins by charging seigniorage, the difference between the face value of the coin and the cost of the metal and production. More problematically, rulers learned they could debase coinage by reducing precious metal content while maintaining the same face value. This allowed them to mint more coins from the same amount of metal, effectively creating money to fund expenses. In the short term, debasement could finance wars or public works. In the long term, it eroded trust in the currency and caused inflation. The Athenian silver tetradrachm became something like an international currency in the Mediterranean world between 450 and 300 BCE. These coins contained about 17 grams of high-purity silver and were trusted throughout the region. Athens benefited enormously from this status. Foreign merchants preferred Athenian coins for international trade, creating demand that allowed Athens to export coins and import goods, essentially profiting from its monetary credibility. The phenomenon resembled how the US dollar would function 2 millennia later. Other cities tried to achieve similar status by maintaining high standards for their coinage, but Athenian coins remained the gold standard, or more accurately the silver standard, for generations. Alexander the Great's conquest between 334 and 323 BCE spread coinage across an enormous territory, from Greece to Egypt to India. Alexander minted coins on an unprecedented scale to pay his armies and fund his campaigns. He standardized weight and purity across his empire, making his coins acceptable from Macedonia to Bactria. After his death, his successors continued minting coins in his style, with Alexander's image remaining on coins for decades after he died. This was the first time a single monetary system had functioned across such a vast area, foreshadowing the later Roman monetary integration. The Roman Republic adopted coinage relatively late, around 300 BCE, several centuries after the practice became common in Greece. Early Roman money took the form of heavy bronze bars called aes signatum, literally signed bronze, which were cast rather than struck. These evolved into round bronze coins called asses. Rome eventually adopted precious metal coinage, with silver denarii becoming the standard coin of the Roman economy by 200 BCE. A denarius initially contained about 4.5 grams of silver and was worth 10 bronze asses, giving it its name from the Latin decem meaning 10. Roman coinage spread with Roman conquest, creating the largest unified monetary system the ancient world had yet seen. By the 1st century CE, Roman coins circulated from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Danube. This integration facilitated trade on an unprecedented scale. A merchant in Gaul could do business with a merchant in Syria using the same currency. The Roman state minted enormous quantities of coins, with modern estimates suggesting hundreds of millions of denarii in circulation at the empire's peak. The scale of coin production required industrial mining operations, particularly in Spain, where Roman silver mines employed thousands of workers. The images on Roman coins evolved to serve political purposes. During the Republic, coins featured traditional symbols including gods, goddesses, and legendary events from Roman history. The social war of 91 to 88 BCE saw rebels minting their own coins with anti-Roman imagery, demonstrating that coin production was an assertion of sovereignty. During the civil wars that ended the Republic, rival generals used coins as propaganda, depicting their military victories and making claims to legitimate authority. That Julius Caesar was the first living Roman to have his portrait on coins, a practice that had been common in Hellenistic kingdoms, but was controversial in Rome where it smacked of monarchy. The Roman Empire under Augustus and his successors made systematic use of coinage for political communication. Emperors used coins to announce military victories, publicize building projects, claim divine favor, and assert their legitimacy. Because coins circulated throughout the empire and passed through countless hands, they functioned as mass media. A coin minted in Rome to celebrate a victory in Germania would eventually reach merchants in Egypt, carrying its message to people who would never see an official announcement. Historians use coin evidence to date events, track the geographic extent of different emperors' authority, and understand how rulers wanted to be perceived. The Romans faced a persistent problem with counterfeiting and debasement. Private counterfeiters produced fake coins with less precious metal than official ones. This was a serious crime, often punishable by death, but the profit potential made it worth the risk for some. More problematic was official debasement. Emperors facing financial pressures gradually reduced the silver content of denarii while maintaining their face value. A denarius from Augustus's reign contained about 4 grams of pure silver. By the 3rd century CE, denarii contained less than 1 gram of silver, with the rest being bronze. People noticed. Prices rose as the real value of coins fell. Gresham's law, the principle that bad money drives out good money, operated in the Roman economy. When new debased coins appeared alongside older coins with higher precious metal content, people would spend the debased coins and hoard the good ones. The good coins disappeared from circulation, melted down for their metal content, or simply held as stores of value. This accelerated the debasement problem. The more the currency was debased, the more people hoarded good coins, leaving only debased coins in active circulation. The government responded by debasing further to maintain revenue, creating a downward spiral. The crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 284 CE, saw the Roman monetary system nearly collapse. Rapid turnover of emperors, each minting their own coins to pay their armies, created proliferating and competing currencies. Some regional coins became worthless outside their immediate areas. The Antoninianus, a coin that was supposed to be worth 2 denarii, initially contained about 5 grams of silver, but by the 260s contained less than 2% silver, essentially being a bronze coin with silver plating. Prices exploded. The Roman government tried to control inflation through price edicts, establishing maximum prices for thousands of goods and services, but these proved unenforceable. Emperor Diocletian attempted to restore the currency in the 290s CE by introducing new coins with higher precious metal content. His reforms had limited success, partly because trust in Roman coinage had been so thoroughly undermined that people remained skeptical of any official coins. Constantine later introduced the solidus, a gold coin of consistent weight and purity that became the most stable currency in the Mediterranean world for centuries. The solidus succeeded where other reforms had failed because Constantine maintained its precious metal content, never debasing it even during financial pressures. This consistency restored some confidence in Roman currency. The Western Roman Empire's collapse in the 5th century CE disrupted the monetary economy throughout Western Europe. The sophisticated minting operations, the long-distance trade networks, and the trust in currency that had characterized the imperial system all broke down. In many regions, coined money largely disappeared from circulation. Local economies reverted to barter and payment in kind. The tax system, which had relied on monetary payments, collapsed. Kings and local lords began paying their warriors with grants of land rather than with coins. The monetary sophistication that had taken centuries to develop unraveled within generations. However, coinage never entirely disappeared. The Byzantine Empire in the East continued minting high-quality gold coins. Islamic caliphates that arose in the 7th century adopted coinage and eventually developed their own minting traditions. Some trade routes continued to operate using coins even as local economies largely abandoned them. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain minted small silver coins called ciatus. Charlemagne's Frankish Empire instituted a new silver standard in the late 8th century. These were pale shadows of the Roman monetary system, operating on much smaller scales and with less sophistication, but they maintained the practice of coinage through the early medieval period. The legacy of ancient coinage extended far beyond the circulation of any particular coins. The invention established that value could be standardized and guaranteed by political authority. It demonstrated that anonymous market exchange could function efficiently when supported by trusted currency. It showed that monetary systems could integrate vast territories economically. It also revealed the dangers of debasement and the importance of maintaining currency credibility. These lessons would be learned and forgotten and relearned across different societies over the following centuries. The basic innovation, stamping metal to guarantee weight and purity, proved so useful that it would remain the dominant form of money for another 1,000 years. But the next major transformation in money would come from an unexpected direction. From a Chinese insight that value could be represented not by precious metal, but by marks on paper. In the early 9th century CE, Chinese merchants faced a practical problem. The Tang dynasty economy had grown to such a scale that conducting large transactions in metal coins became physically burdensome. Copper coins were the standard currency, but copper is heavy. Carrying enough coins to purchase a large shipment of goods might require carts and guards. Moving significant wealth across long distances was dangerous, expensive, and slow. Merchants operating along trade routes needed a better solution. They found it by depositing their coins with trusted agents in one city and receiving paper certificates that could be redeemed for coins in another city. This system of flying money was not quite paper currency, but it represented the first step toward divorcing money from physical metal. The flying money system worked because it operated within networks of trust. A merchant might deposit 1,000 copper coins with an agent in Chang'an and receive a paper certificate. When the merchant arrived in Chengdu weeks later, they could present the certificate to a partner agent and receive 1,000 coins, minus a fee for the service. The system required the two agents to trust each other enough to settle accounts periodically. It required merchants to trust that the agents wouldn't disappear with their money. The paper certificate itself had no intrinsic value, only the promise it represented. This was money as pure abstraction, dependent entirely on institutional credibility rather than material worth. The Song dynasty, which came to power in 960 CE, Han took the concept further. Sichuan province faced a particular coin shortage in the early 11th century. Transporting coins from other regions was expensive and couldn't fully supply the local economy. In 1023, the government authorized the production of juzi, official paper notes that functioned as currency. These notes could be exchanged for coins at government offices, but more importantly, they were accepted as payment for taxes and in commercial transactions. This was the world's first government-issued paper money, a development that would not occur in Europe for another 7 centuries. The juzi notes were printed on special paper made from mulberry bark and bore multiple anti-counterfeiting features, including complex designs, multiple colours, and official seals. The production was carefully controlled, that is, with severe penalties for counterfeiting, including death. Initially, the notes were issued with expiration dates, requiring holders to exchange them for new notes periodically. This allowed the government to control the money supply and prevent excessive accumulation. The system worked reasonably well for several decades, with paper money facilitating trade and solving the coin shortage problem in regions where it circulated. The success of paper money in limited regions led to broader adoption. By the mid-13th century, under Mongol rule, paper money became the primary currency throughout China. Kublai Khan's government issued paper notes and required their acceptance for all transactions. The Mongol rulers even prohibited the use of gold and silver for everyday transactions, insisting that all commerce use paper money. This was an unprecedented monetary experiment, attempting to run an enormous economy entirely on paper currency, backed only by government decree rather than by precious metal reserves. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who travelled to China in the 1270s, witnessed this paper money system and described it with amazement in his travel accounts. Europeans found his descriptions difficult to believe. How could mere paper have value? How could a government simply declare that printed documents were money and have people accept them? The European monetary imagination was still firmly tied to precious metals. The idea that value could exist independently of gold or silver seemed absurd. Polo's accounts were dismissed by many as exaggeration or fantasy, though he was reporting accurately what he had seen. The Chinese paper money system eventually collapsed under the weight of government overprinting. Mongol rulers, facing military expenses and administrative costs, began issuing more notes than could be backed by the economy's productive capacity. The predictable result was inflation. Prices rose as the value of paper money fell. Merchants began demanding more notes for the same goods. The government responded by printing even more money to meet its expenses, accelerating the inflationary spiral. By the early 14th century, confidence in paper money had eroded severely. People hoarded coins and tried to avoid accepting paper notes when possible. The Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols in 1368, initially attempted to continue the paper money system. They issued new notes called baochao and tried to maintain their value through various regulations, including prohibiting private use of gold and silver for transactions. However, the Ming government also fell into the trap of overprinting. By the mid-15th century, Ming paper money had lost most of its value through inflation. The government eventually gave up on paper currency, and the Chinese economy returned to silver and copper coins for the next several centuries. The paper money experiment had failed, but the concept had been proven possible even if sustainable implementation remained elusive. While China experimented with paper money, medieval Europe developed different instruments for moving value without moving metal. Italian merchants in the 13th and 14th centuries created bills of exchange, documents that transferred value across distance through a network of banking relationships. A merchant in Venice wanting to purchase goods in Bruges might visit a banker who would write a bill of exchange. The merchant would carry this document to Bruges, where a correspondent banker would pay out the local currency. The two bankers would later settle accounts through the flow of bills in both directions. Bills of exchange served multiple purposes beyond simple money transfer. They allowed merchants to avoid physically transporting coins across dangerous roads where robbery was common. They provided a way to exchange currencies at a time when hundreds of different coinages circulated in Europe, each with different values and varying degrees of debasement. They also allowed merchants to circumvent usury laws. The Catholic Church prohibited charging interest on loans, but bills of exchange concealed interest charges within exchange rate differences and fees, allowing profit from lending while maintaining technical compliance with religious law. The mechanics of bills of exchange created what was effectively a credit system operating across Europe. A merchant might receive goods now and pay later through a bill of exchange that wouldn't be presented for payment for weeks or months. This meant that much commerce operated on credit, with the bills themselves circulating as a form of money among merchants who trusted the issuing bankers. The system worked because it operated within tight-knit communities of merchants and bankers who knew each other's reputations and maintained relationships across generations. Trust was personal and networked rather than institutional. The Medici Bank of Florence, operating from the 14th to 15th centuries, built an empire on these credit instruments and long-distance banking relationships. The Medici established correspondent banks in major European commercial centres, including London, Bruges, Lyon, Geneva, and Rome. These branches didn't just transfer money but extended credit, managed accounts, and dealt in currency exchange. The Medici became effectively the bankers to European nobility and the papacy, their credit backing major political and military ventures. Their success demonstrated that banking and credit could generate wealth, rivaling that from trade or landholding. The development of double-entry bookkeeping in 14th century Italy provided the accounting tools necessary for this increasingly complex financial system. Double-entry bookkeeping, which records each transaction in two accounts, showing both the source and use of funds, allowed merchants and bankers to track intricate webs of credit and debt. This innovation was as important as any physical form of money. It made possible the systematic management of credit relationships, the calculation of profits and losses, and the detection of fraud or accounting errors. Banking could not have achieved its later sophistication without this accounting framework. Despite these sophisticated credit instruments, Europe remained firmly committed to metal currency for everyday transactions, and gold and silver coins circulated throughout medieval and early modern Europe, minted by kingdoms, duchies, free cities, and even powerful bishops. The multiplicity of coinages created constant exchange problems. A merchant travelling from one region to another would need to exchange coins multiple times, paying fees each time and dealing with varying exchange rates. Money changers became essential economic actors, sitting at tables in marketplaces and at fairs, exchanging the bewildering variety of coinages and making profits from the spreads. The Spanish discovery of enormous silver deposits in the Americas, particularly at Potosi in present-day Bolivia, flooded Europe with precious metal in the 16th century. Ships carried tons of silver from American mines to Spain, where much of it was minted into coins that flowed throughout Europe and beyond. The sudden increase in money supply relative to available goods caused substantial inflation. Prices across Europe roughly tripled between 1500 and 1650. This inflation puzzled contemporary observers who had not yet developed clear theories of the relationship between money supply and price levels. It also demonstrated that precious metal currencies were not as stable as people had assumed. Goldsmiths in England and the Netherlands inadvertently created the foundations of modern banking in the 17th century. Merchants and wealthy individuals deposited gold and silver with goldsmiths for safe storage, receiving receipts acknowledging the deposits. These receipts began circulating as payment instruments. If a merchant owed money to a supplier, they might simply give the supplier a goldsmith's receipt rather than withdrawing the actual gold. The supplier could either redeem the receipt for gold or use it to pay someone else. The receipts functioned as paper money backed by specific gold deposits. Goldsmiths noticed that most depositors never actually withdrew their gold. The metal sat in vaults while receipts circulated. This observation led to a crucial innovation. Goldsmiths began issuing more receipts than they had gold to back them. They made loans by writing receipts for gold that didn't exist in their vaults, knowing that as long as most depositors didn't demand their gold simultaneously, the system would work. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, where banks hold only a fraction of deposits in reserve while lending out the rest. The practice created money that existed only as accounting entries and promises. The Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, represented a new model of banking that combined elements of earlier Italian banking with public institutional backing. The bank was created by the city government to address problems with debased and clipped coins that plagued Amsterdam's commerce. Merchants could deposit coins at the bank and receive credit in bank guilders, a unit of account that maintained stable value while actual coins deteriorated through debasement and wear. The bank initially operated as a pure deposit and exchange bank, not lending out deposits, which gave it a reputation for absolute safety and stability. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, took a different approach that would prove influential for future central banking. It was established as a private institution but with a special relationship to the government. The bank was created to lend money to the government, which needed funds for war with France. In exchange for this loan, the bank received the right to issue banknotes. These notes were initially receipts for gold deposited at the bank, but they began circulating as currency. The Bank of England's notes gradually became the most trusted paper currency in Britain, backed both by the bank's gold reserves and implicitly by government support. By 1700, multiple forms of money coexisted in European economies. Gold and silver coins remained the most common currency for everyday transactions. Bills of exchange facilitated long-distance trade and credit. Goldsmiths' receipts and early banknotes circulated in commercial centres. Government bonds and debt instruments represented another form of stored value. The monetary system had become complex and layered, with different instruments serving different purposes. Metal coins still represented money in most people's minds, but increasingly the money that mattered for commerce and high finance was credit and paper. The conceptual shift from money as a thing to money as a promise was well underway, though it would take several more centuries to complete. The next phase would see governments take fuller control of paper currency and eventually break the remaining links to precious metals, creating the purely fiat monetary systems that would dominate the 20th century. The 18th century began with money still firmly tied to precious metals in the minds of most people and in the practice of most governments. Gold and silver coins remained the primary currency for ordinary transactions. Paper money existed but was viewed with suspicion, seen as a convenience that derived its value from being convertible to metal. The idea that paper might have value independent of metal backing seemed dangerous, likely to lead to inflation and economic chaos. The historical records seem to support this caution. Every experiment with unbacked paper money, from Chinese dynasties to revolutionary France, had ended in overprinting and currency collapse. Yet the next 3 centuries would see a gradual, irregular, and often traumatic movement away from metal-backed money toward purely fiat systems based only on government authority and public trust. Britain inadvertently pioneered paper currency during the Napoleonic Wars. The war with France from 1793 to 1815 required enormous government spending. The Bank of England, which had been issuing notes convertible to gold since its founding, faced increasing demands for gold redemption as people lost confidence during wartime uncertainty. In 1797, facing the prospect of depleting its gold reserves entirely, the bank suspended convertibility, For the first time, Bank of England notes could not be exchanged for gold on demand. The notes became, temporarily, pure fiat currency backed only by faith in the institution and the government behind it. The suspension was supposed to be brief, lasting only until the war emergency passed. Instead, it continued for 24 years until 1821. During this period, Britain operated on inconvertible paper money while fighting and ultimately winning the Napoleonic Wars. The experience demonstrated that a major economy could function on paper currency during extended periods without immediate collapse. However, inflation did occur, with prices rising substantially during the suspension period. This reinforced the view that paper money needed metal backing to maintain stability. When convertibility was restored in 1821, it was seen as a return to sound monetary principles after a necessary but regrettable wartime deviation. The gold standard as a formal system emerged gradually during the 19th century. Britain officially adopted a gold standard in 1821, defining the pound sterling as equivalent to a specific quantity of gold and allowing anyone to exchange paper notes for gold at that fixed rate. Other countries followed over the following decades, though the timing varied. Germany adopted a gold standard in 1871 after unification. The United States moved to gold in 1879 after years of debate about whether to maintain bimetallic silver and gold standards. France and other European nations joined by the 1870s and 1880s. By 1900, most economically significant nations operated on some form of gold standard. The logic behind the gold standard rested on several assumptions. Gold was scarce and couldn't be created arbitrarily, so linking money to gold would prevent governments from printing excessive currency and causing inflation. The fixed relationship between currencies and gold would create stable exchange rates between different national currencies, facilitating international trade. If a country's currency became overvalued or undervalued relative to gold, automatic mechanisms would correct the imbalance through gold flows between nations. These assumptions made the gold standard appear to be a self-regulating system that would maintain monetary stability without requiring active management or discretionary government policy. The reality was more complex. The gold standard did create relatively stable exchange rates between major currencies, which helped international trade and investment. A British merchant could contract to be paid in German marks months in the future, without worrying that exchange rates would change dramatically before payment came due. International capital could flow more freely when currencies maintained stable relationships. The late 19th century saw substantial economic integration across the gold standard countries, with capital, goods, and people moving across borders with fewer monetary complications than in earlier periods. However, the gold standard also imposed constraints that could be economically painful. If a country experienced a trade deficit, gold would flow out to pay for excess imports. This gold outflow would reduce the domestic money supply, potentially causing deflation and economic contraction. The prescribed solution was to let this deflation happen, which would make the country's goods cheaper and more competitive internationally, eventually reversing the trade deficit. In practice, this meant that countries on the gold standard sometimes had to accept recessions or even depressions as the price of maintaining currency convertibility. The system privileged monetary stability over employment and economic growth. The California gold rush beginning in 1848 and the later Australian gold discoveries of the 1850s demonstrated another feature of commodity money systems. The money supply could be dramatically affected by purely physical discoveries. The flood of new gold from these sources increased global gold supplies substantially, effectively increasing the world money supply and causing gradual inflation during the mid-19th century. This was inflation not from government policy but from mining success. The connection between monetary conditions and random geological facts created economic effects that no one consciously chose or controlled. The United States experienced particularly intense political conflicts over monetary standards in the late 19th century. Farmers and debtors generally favoured inflation, which would make their debts easier to repay and raise the prices of agricultural commodities. Creditors and financial interests favoured deflation, or stable prices, which preserved the value of money owed to them. These conflicts played out in debates about whether to maintain gold backing exclusively, or to add silver to the monetary base, which would increase the money supply and cause inflation. The debate culminated in the 1896 presidential election, where William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech attacked the gold standard as favouring creditors over workers and farmers. Bryan lost the election, and the United States remained on the gold standard. But the political tensions revealed a fundamental problem with commodity-backed money. Its quantity was determined by mining output and gold stocks, rather than by the needs of the economy. If the economy grew faster than gold supplies, the result would be deflation as more goods chased the same amount of money. If gold discoveries outpaced economic growth, inflation would result. Neither outcome reflected deliberate policy choices aimed at economic health. The gold standard essentially delegated monetary policy to miners and geology. World War I shattered the gold standard system that had functioned with reasonable success for several decades. The war required massive government spending beyond what tax revenue could provide. Governments borrowed extensively and also printed money. Maintaining gold convertibility would have constrained this monetary expansion, so most combatant nations suspended convertibility during the war. Britain suspended in 1914. Other nations followed. The war was financed partly through conventional borrowing, but substantially through monetary expansion that would have been impossible under strict gold standard rules. The suspension of gold convertibility during the war led to substantial inflation in all combatant nations. Prices roughly doubled in Britain between 1914 and 1918. In Germany and other Central Powers, inflation was far worse. The war's end left European economies with inflated price levels, large government debts, and currencies that were no longer tied to gold. The question facing policymakers in the 1920s was whether and how to return to gold standard systems. The general consensus was that returning to gold represented a return to normalcy and sound finance, but the practical difficulties were substantial. Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity, meaning the pound was valued at the same gold quantity as before the war despite the inflation that had occurred. This decision, advocated by Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, required severe deflation to bring British prices down to levels consistent with the pre-war exchange rate. The deflation contributed to high unemployment and economic stagnation in Britain during the late 1920s. The economist John Maynard Keynes argued that the return to gold at the old parity was a mistake that sacrificed employment and growth for monetary symbolism. The worldwide Great Depression that began in 1929 delivered the final blow to the classical gold standard. As economic output collapsed and unemployment soared, countries faced a choice between maintaining gold convertibility and taking actions to stimulate their economies. The gold standard constrained monetary expansion and required countries to maintain currency values, even as their economies contracted. One by one, countries chose to abandon gold rather than accept continued depression. Britain left the gold standard in 1931. The United States effectively left it in 1933, when President Franklin Roosevelt prohibited private gold ownership and devalued the dollar relative to gold. Abandoning the gold standard allowed countries to pursue expansionary monetary policies to combat the depression. Countries that left gold earlier generally recovered faster than those that clung to convertibility longer. This correlation suggested that the gold standard had been constraining recovery, forcing countries to maintain tight monetary policies when their economies desperately needed stimulus. The experience thoroughly discredited the idea that the gold standard was an automatic, self-regulating system that would maintain prosperity. Instead, it appeared to be a rigid constraint that could worsen economic crises. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944 as World War II neared its end, attempted to create a new international monetary order that would capture some benefits of the gold standard while avoiding its rigidities. The system centered on the US dollar, which was defined as convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, but only for foreign governments and central banks, not for private citizens. Other currencies were defined in terms of dollars rather than directly in terms of gold. The dollar effectively became the world's reserve currency, with other nations holding dollars as a store of value and medium for international transactions. Bretton Woods worked reasonably well for about 2 decades. The system provided relatively stable exchange rates, facilitating the enormous expansion of international trade in the post-war period. The dollar's role as reserve currency gave the United States special advantages, allowing it to run persistent trade deficits because other countries needed to accumulate dollars for their reserves. American economic dominance in the immediate post-war period, when the US economy was roughly half of global output, just made this arrangement workable. The dollar was genuinely as good as gold when the United States held most of the world's gold reserves and ran a strong economy. The system began showing strain by the 1960s. The United States was running persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars abroad than were returning through exports or capital inflows. Foreign governments and central banks accumulated large dollar holdings, theoretically redeemable for gold. Meanwhile, US gold reserves were declining. The economist Robert Triffin identified a fundamental contradiction in the system. For the dollar to serve as the world's reserve currency, the United States needed to run deficits to supply dollars to the rest of the world, but persistent deficits would eventually undermine confidence in dollar-gold convertibility. This became known as the Triffin dilemma. President Charles de Gaulle of France drew attention to the problem in the 1960s by actually demanding gold in exchange for dollars, questioning why France should finance American deficits by holding dollars. Other countries began to doubt whether the United States really could maintain dollar convertibility to gold, given the declining ratio of gold reserves to dollar liabilities. Speculation against the dollar increased. The United States faced the prospect of a run on its gold reserves similar to bank runs, where if everyone tried to convert simultaneously, the system would collapse even though it might have been sustainable if everyone maintained confidence. President Richard Nixon closed the gold window on August 15, 1971, suspending the convertibility of dollars to gold. The action was presented as temporary, but it proved permanent. This decision ended the last official link between major currencies and gold. For the first time in history, the world's monetary system operated entirely on fiat currency, money that had value only because governments said it did and people accepted it. There was no commodity backing, no promise of convertibility to precious metal, just faith in the issuing governments and the economic systems those currencies represented. The immediate aftermath of breaking from gold was chaotic. Exchange rates between major currencies, which had been fixed under Bretton Woods, began floating freely based on market supply and demand. The dollar declined substantially against other major currencies in the early 1970s. Inflation accelerated in the United States and other countries, partly because governments no longer faced the discipline of maintaining gold convertibility. The 1970s saw high inflation combined with slow economic growth, a combination called stagflation that conventional economic theory had suggested was impossible. Some economists and politicians argued that abandoning gold backing would lead to unlimited monetary expansion and the destruction of currency value. Gold advocates predicted that without the discipline imposed by convertibility, governments would print money recklessly, causing runaway inflation or even hyperinflation. These predictions seemed to be coming true in the 1970s, when inflation reached double digits in the United States and other developed nations. The decade saw serious discussion about whether fiat currencies could survive or whether some return to commodity backing was necessary to restore monetary stability. However, central banks eventually learned to manage fiat currencies without gold backing. The key was establishing credibility that they would control inflation even without the automatic constraint of gold convertibility. The Federal Reserve under Chairman Paul Volcker demonstrated this in the early 1980s by raising interest rates dramatically to break inflation, accepting a severe recession as the price of restoring price stability. This painful adjustment established that fiat money could be managed responsibly through central bank policy, even without commodity backing. Other central banks followed similar approaches, developing frameworks for inflation targeting and monetary policy that didn't rely on gold. By the end of the 20th century, the gold standard existed only in the proposals of a few economists and politicians who argued for its restoration. Mainstream economics and policy had moved on to managing fiat currencies through central bank policy. Gold continued to be held as a reserve asset by central banks and as an investment by private holders, but it no longer defined currency values. Money had completed its transformation from a thing with intrinsic value to a pure social construct, valuable only because of collective agreement and institutional credibility. The question was no longer what backed money, but rather who controlled it, and for what purposes. The answers to those questions would shape monetary developments in the digital age that was just beginning. The first significant step toward digital money came not from technology companies or financial innovators, but from a restaurant owner frustrated with carrying multiple credit cards. In 1950, Frank McNamara founded Diners Club after reportedly forgetting his wallet at a New York restaurant and having to call his wife to bring money. The Diners Club card allowed members to charge meals at participating restaurants and pay the bill monthly. This was not entirely new. Department stores had offered charge accounts for decades, but Diners Club was the first card accepted at multiple unrelated establishments. The card itself was just cardboard, but it represented a conceptual shift. Purchases could be recorded as data entries rather than immediate exchanges of physical money. Bank of America introduced the Bank AmeriCard in 1958, which became Visa in 1976. This was the first general-purpose credit card that allowed revolving credit, meaning cardholders could pay partial balances and carry debt from month to month while paying interest. The card created a new form of money that existed as credit extended by banks to consumers for everyday purchases. When you bought something with a credit card, no money actually moved at the point of sale. Instead, the bank recorded that you owed them money, the merchant recorded that the bank owed them money, and these obligations would be settled later through electronic transfers between bank accounts. The purchase happened through data entries, not through any physical transfer of value. The technology enabling credit cards was surprisingly simple initially. Early cards had raised numbers that could be recorded by pressing carbon paper against the card with a manual imprinting device. Merchants would send these paper records to banks for processing. The entire system ran on paper documents that were physically transported and manually processed. The innovation was not technological but conceptual and organizational, creating networks of participating merchants and banks that would honor each other's cards and settle accounts through centralized clearing systems. Technology would later make the system faster and more efficient, but the basic model worked even with primitive technology. Then automated teller machines began appearing in the late 1960s, with the first modern ATM installed by Barclays Bank in London in 1967. These machines allowed customers to withdraw cash without entering a bank branch or interacting with a human teller. Early ATMs were simple devices that dispensed fixed amounts of cash when customers inserted special cards. Later versions became more sophisticated, allowing balance inquiries, deposits, and transfers between accounts. The significance went beyond mere convenience. ATMs demonstrated that banking could be automated, that computers could manage financial transactions, and that people would trust machines with their money. The development of computer networks in the 1970s enabled electronic funds transfer systems that moved money between banks without physical transport of cash or checks. The Clearinghouse Interbank Payments System, launched in 1970, allowed banks to settle large transactions electronically. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, better known as SWIFT, began operations in 1973 to standardize international financial messages and enable cross-border electronic transfers. These systems moved enormous sums daily through electronic messages rather than through physical movement of money. $1 billion transaction became an exchange of encrypted data packets traveling through telecommunications networks. By the 1980s, the majority of money in developed economies existed only as electronic records in bank computers. When you received a paycheck, your employer probably didn't hand you cash or even a physical check that you deposited. Instead, they sent an electronic message to their bank, which adjusted its records to show less money in the employer's account, and sent a message to your bank, which adjusted its records to show more money in your account. No physical money moved. The transaction was purely digital, accomplished through changes in database entries at different institutions. Most people still thought of money as physical objects, but increasingly it was just information. Credit and debit cards became ubiquitous in developed countries by the 1990s. The magnetic stripe on the back of cards allowed them to be read by electronic terminals, making transactions faster and creating immediate electronic records. Point-of-sale terminals at stores connected to bank networks, allowing real-time authorization of transactions. When you swiped a card, the terminal contacted your bank to verify you had sufficient funds or credit, received authorization, and recorded the transaction. The entire process took seconds. The merchant never touched physical money, and neither did you. The transaction existed purely as electronic data. The rise of personal computing and the internet in the 1990s created new possibilities for digital money. Companies began offering online bill payment services. Banks developed websites where customers could check balances and transfer funds. E-commerce sites like Amazon and eBay needed ways for customers to pay without physically handing over cash or mailing checks. PayPal, founded in 1998, created a system for sending money via email, linking to bank accounts or credit cards, and allowing person-to-person transfers and online purchases. Money was becoming something that lived on the internet, transferred through clicking buttons on websites. The transformation of money into data had profound implications that were not always obvious. When money becomes information, it can be moved at the speed of light across global distances. A transaction that would have taken weeks in the era of physical money transfer could now happen in seconds. This enabled new forms of commerce and investment, but also created new vulnerabilities. Computer errors or malfeasance could make money disappear or appear incorrectly. Security became crucial because money could be stolen by someone thousands of miles away who never physically touched anything. The nature of theft changed from physical robbery to data manipulation. Fractional reserve banking. The practice of banks lending out more money than they hold in deposits had existed for centuries but reached new scales in the digital era. When money is physical, there are practical limits on how much credit banks can create. You can only lend out so many actual coins or bills. When money is digital, the constraints are purely regulatory and mathematical. A bank can create a loan by simply adjusting numbers in their computer system, crediting the borrower's account with money that didn't previously exist. This created money as real and spendable as money from any other source. The total money supply became vastly larger than the physical currency in existence. The derivatives market that exploded in the 1990s and 2000s represented money becoming abstraction of abstraction. A derivative is a financial instrument whose value derives from something else, like a stock price or interest rate or commodity price. You could buy and sell derivatives based on whether you thought some underlying value would go up or down, without ever owning the underlying asset. Credit default swaps, for example, were essentially insurance policies on whether a particular debt would be repaid, but they could be bought and sold by people who had no connection to the original debt. These instruments existed purely as contracts and computer records. The derivatives market grew to enormous size with notional values reaching into the hundreds of trillions of dollars by the 2000s. This was money as pure abstraction, with values that existed only in relation to other abstractions, and which could be created through agreement between parties without any physical asset or even any traditional form of money changing hands. Two parties could agree on a derivative contract, record it in their respective computer systems, and create financial obligations worth millions or billions of dollars through nothing more than data entry and legal agreement. The financial system had become layers of abstraction built on abstractions. High-frequency trading emerged in the 2000s as computer technology became powerful enough to execute trades in milliseconds. Firms developed algorithms that could analyze market conditions and execute thousands of trades per second, far faster than any human could process information or make decisions. These algorithms would detect tiny price differences and exploit them before they disappeared, making small profits on each trade but executing so many trades that the profits accumulated substantially. By the mid-2000s, high-frequency trading accounted for a significant percentage of stock market volume. Money was moving at speeds determined not by human decision-making, but by the processing speed of computers. The development of high-frequency trading meant that the money moving through financial markets was increasingly detached from human understanding or control. An algorithm might buy and sell a stock in milliseconds, holding it for less time than it would take a human to perceive what was happening. The trade was profitable according to the algorithm's programming, but no human had made any decision about it. Money had become something that moved through economic systems according to rules programmed into computers, operating at speeds and scales that exceeded human cognitive capacity to fully comprehend or manage. Securitization represented another layer of abstraction added to the financial system. Banks would package hundreds or thousands of mortgages into a security that could be bought and sold like a bond. These mortgage-backed securities could themselves be packaged with other securities into collateralized debt obligations. The CDOs could be sliced into different tranches with different risk levels. You could buy a security that represented a claim on a portion of the interest payments from a subset of mortgages that you would never see, and that might be scattered across an entire country. The connection between the financial instrument and any actual physical asset like a house became so attenuated that few people understood what they actually owned. The complexity of these instruments created serious problems that became apparent during the 2008 financial crisis. When housing prices began falling and mortgage defaults increased, it became unclear which securities were affected and by how much. A mortgage-backed security might contain some good mortgages and some bad ones, but it was difficult to determine the actual risk. CDOs built from mortgage-backed securities were even more opaque. Rating agencies had certified many of these securities as low risk, but those ratings proved wildly inaccurate. Investors who thought they owned safe investments discovered they owned complex derivatives whose value was plummeting. The failure of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 demonstrated how interconnected and fragile the financial system had become. Lehman was deeply involved in derivatives markets, with contracts linking it to hundreds of other institutions. When Lehman collapsed, it couldn't meet its obligations on these contracts, which created losses for its counterparties, which created risks for their counterparties, spreading through the system like a contagion. The interconnections were so complex that it was difficult to determine which institutions were at risk and by how much. Trust collapsed because no one knew which institutions might be the next to fail. The financial crisis revealed that the transformation of money into digital abstractions had created systemic risks that were poorly understood and inadequately regulated. The sheer complexity of the financial system meant that even sophisticated investors and regulators couldn't fully assess risks. The speed at which money moved electronically meant that problems could spread globally within hours. The dependence on computer systems meant that technical failures or errors could have massive consequences. The fact that most money existed only as data entries meant that financial losses didn't require any physical destruction, just changes in the numbers recorded in databases. Central banks responded to the crisis with unprecedented interventions. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other major central banks created trillions of dollars, euros, and other currencies to support failing financial institutions and stimulate economies. This money creation happened entirely through digital means. Central banks didn't print physical currency. They simply credited the accounts of banks with new money, created through entries in computer systems. The scale of money creation would have been impossible in an era of physical currency. The digital nature of modern money made it possible for central banks to create amounts that would have required printing presses running continuously for years. Quantitative easing, the term for this massive money creation, demonstrated that modern money is fundamentally different from historical forms of currency. The Federal Reserve created over $3 trillion between 2008 and 2014 through quantitative easing. This money didn't exist before. It wasn't backed by gold or any other asset. The Fed simply created it by purchasing government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from banks, paying for these purchases by crediting the bank's reserve accounts at the Fed. The numbers in the bank's accounts increased, and that increase was money, as real and spendable as any other money in the system. The financial crisis and the response to it revealed that in the modern monetary system, money is created primarily by banks making loans and by central banks creating reserves. The total money supply bears little relationship to physical currency. In the United States, physical currency represents less than 10% of the broad money supply. The rest exists only as electronic records. Moreover, this electronic money can be created in almost unlimited quantities by central banks when they choose to do so. The constraint on money creation is not physical or technical, but political and economic. Concerns about inflation, e-currency stability, and the real productive capacity of the economy. Money had become entirely abstract, limited only by institutional credibility and economic consequences rather than by any physical constraint. This transformation set the stage for the next development, attempts to create money systems that didn't depend on central institutions at all. On October 31, 2008, as the financial crisis was devastating global markets and central banks were preparing unprecedented interventions, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page paper titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The paper proposed a method for creating digital money that would not require trusted third parties like banks or governments. The timing was not coincidental. The financial crisis had shattered faith in institutions that were supposed to manage money responsibly. Major banks had taken reckless risks and required taxpayer bailouts to survive. Central banks were creating trillions in new money through digital keystrokes. The question that had been solved thousands of years earlier through temples, kings, and later through central banks was being asked again. How do you create money that people can trust without requiring them to trust powerful institutions? Bitcoin's innovation was solving what computer scientists called the double spending problem. Digital information can be copied perfectly and infinitely. If money is just digital information, what prevents someone from copying it and spending the same money multiple times? Previous digital money systems solved this by having a trusted central authority keep records of who owned what. Your bank ensures you can't spend the same dollar twice by checking your balance before approving transactions. Bitcoin proposed solving this problem without any central authority through a distributed ledger called a blockchain that would be maintained collectively by participants in the network. The blockchain is essentially a shared record book that everyone can see and verify, but no one can alter retroactively. When someone wants to send Bitcoin to someone else, they broadcast the transaction to the network. Participants called miners compete to gather pending transactions into blocks and add those blocks to the chain. Adding a block requires solving a difficult computational puzzle that takes substantial computing power. The first miner to solve the puzzle gets to add their block to the chain and receives newly created Bitcoin as a reward. Other participants verify that the solution is correct and that the transactions in the block are valid, meaning the sender actually has the Bitcoin they're trying to send. The elegance of this system is that it replaces trust in institutions with trust in mathematics and distributed consensus. You don't need to trust that a bank is keeping accurate records because you can verify the blockchain yourself. You don't need to trust that the government won't inflate the currency because the Bitcoin protocol limits total supply to 21 million coins, a limit enforced by code rather than policy promises. No single entity controls Bitcoin. The system operates through incentives that make it more profitable to follow the rules than to cheat, and through transparency that makes cheating extremely difficult to hide. Bitcoin launched in January 2009, and for its first year it existed primarily as an experiment among cryptography enthusiasts and programmers intrigued by the technical achievement. Early transactions were essentially worthless in traditional monetary terms. In May 2010, someone famously paid 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas, a transaction that would later be worth hundreds of millions of dollars at Bitcoin's peak prices. The pizza purchase demonstrated that Bitcoin could function as money in the basic sense of facilitating exchange, even if hardly anyone accepted it, and its value was essentially arbitrary. Bitcoin's value began rising as more people became interested and started mining and trading it. By 2013, 1 Bitcoin traded for over $1,000 before crashing. The price volatility was extreme, far beyond what would be acceptable for a stable currency. But the volatility attracted speculators who saw opportunities for profit. This created a paradox. Bitcoin was designed as a currency for transactions, but it became primarily a speculative investment. People bought Bitcoin hoping its price would increase, not because they wanted to use it to buy things. The more its price rose, the less willing people were to spend it, preferring to hold it as an appreciating asset. Thousands of alternative cryptocurrencies called altcoins emerged in Bitcoin's wake. Ethereum, launched in 2015, extended the blockchain concept beyond simple currency to enable smart contracts, programs that execute automatically when certain conditions are met. Other cryptocurrencies offered faster transaction times, different mining algorithms, or various technical improvements on Bitcoin's design. Most of these alternatives failed or remained insignificant, but the proliferation demonstrated that cryptocurrency had captured significant attention, and that people were experimenting with the fundamental idea of money created and maintained through code rather than institutions. The promise of cryptocurrency appealed to different groups for different reasons. Libertarians appreciated that it operated outside government control and couldn't be inflated by central bank policy. Technology enthusiasts were excited by the distributed ledger technology and its potential applications beyond currency. People in countries with unstable currencies or authoritarian governments saw cryptocurrency as a way to preserve wealth, beyond the reach of incompetent or predatory authorities. Criminals valued the pseudonymity that made transactions difficult to trace back to individuals, using cryptocurrency for drug markets and ransomware payments. However, practical use of cryptocurrency for ordinary transactions remained limited. Transaction fees on the Bitcoin network sometimes reached $50 or more during periods of high usage, making it absurdly expensive to buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin. Transaction processing times could be slow, sometimes taking hours for confirmations. The price volatility meant that a merchant accepting Bitcoin might receive payment worth significantly less by the time they could convert it to traditional currency. Energy consumption for Bitcoin mining became enormous, with some estimates suggesting the Bitcoin network used as much electricity as entire countries, raising serious environmental concerns. Stablecoins emerged as an attempt to solve the volatility problem. These cryptocurrencies were pegged to stable assets like the US dollar, with one unit of the stablecoin supposedly always worth $1. Tether, USD Coin, and other stablecoins achieved this peg through various mechanisms, usually claiming to hold dollar reserves backing each coin. This created an ironic situation where cryptocurrency advocates who had sought to escape fiat currency ended up creating cryptocurrencies explicitly designed to track fiat currency value. The stablecoins acknowledged that cryptocurrency's volatility prevented it from functioning as money for transactions, even as its distributed architecture remained technically functional. Decentralized finance, abbreviated as DeFi, attempted to recreate traditional financial services like lending, borrowing, and trading using cryptocurrency and smart contracts without traditional financial institutions. You could lend cryptocurrency and earn interest, borrow against cryptocurrency collateral, or trade different tokens through automated market makers, all without any bank or broker involved. The services were provided through code running on blockchain networks, theoretically eliminating the need for trusted intermediaries. By 2021, tens of billions of dollars were locked in DeFi protocols. The reality of DeFi revealed limitations in the vision of eliminating intermediaries. Many DeFi platforms were controlled by small groups of developers or early investors who could change the rules. Hacks and exploits were common, with thieves stealing hundreds of millions by finding vulnerabilities in smart contract code. When things went wrong, there was often no recourse because there was no authority to reverse fraudulent transactions or return stolen funds. The elimination of trusted intermediaries meant eliminating the consumer protections and dispute resolution mechanisms that traditional financial systems provided. Users had to become their own security experts and accept total responsibility for their choices with no safety net. Governments responded to cryptocurrency with varying approaches. China banned cryptocurrency trading and mining entirely, viewing it as a threat to financial stability and capital controls. The United States took a more permissive but increasingly regulated approach, with different agencies asserting authority over different aspects of cryptocurrency. El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021, requiring businesses to accept it for payments, though adoption remained limited and the policy controversial. Most governments occupied a middle ground, allowing cryptocurrency to exist while attempting to regulate it, and particularly to enforce tax compliance and prevent money laundering. Central bank digital currencies emerged as governments' response to cryptocurrency, attempting to capture some benefits of digital currency while maintaining central bank control. China began piloting a digital yuan that would allow people to hold accounts directly with the central bank rather than only through commercial banks. The European Central Bank explored a digital euro. These CBDCs would be programmable money that could potentially enable features like automatic tax collection, targeted stimulus payments, or restrictions on what the money could be used for. The technology came from cryptocurrency innovations, but the control remained firmly with central authorities. The question of whether cryptocurrency represents the future of money or an elaborate speculative bubble remains unresolved as of 2026. Bitcoin has survived multiple price crashes and declarations of its death, demonstrating remarkable resilience. The technology has proven functional for moving value across borders without traditional intermediaries. The blockchain concept has found applications beyond currency. Yet cryptocurrency has not replaced traditional money for ordinary transactions. Most people who own cryptocurrency hold it as an investment rather than using it as currency. The original vision of peer-to-peer electronic cash that would replace fiat money seems further away than it did in Bitcoin's early years. The market capitalization of all cryptocurrencies combined reached over $2 trillion at its 2021 peak before crashing. This represents substantial value, though far less than traditional financial assets. More significantly, a cryptocurrency had forced a rethinking of what money is and how it functions. The fact that millions of people voluntarily used and valued something that existed only as entries in a distributed database, with no government backing or intrinsic value, demonstrated that money really is a social construct based on collective belief. If enough people agree something is money and act accordingly, it functions as money regardless of whether it fits traditional definitions. Cryptocurrency also revealed tensions between different desirable properties of money. Bitcoin's fixed supply makes it arguably sound money that can't be inflated, but this same property creates deflationary pressures that discourage spending. Its decentralization means no authority can arbitrarily seize or freeze your Bitcoin, but also means there's no authority to reverse fraudulent transactions or help if you lose your access credentials. Its transparency means all transactions are visible on the blockchain, but its pseudonymity means those transactions aren't necessarily linkable to real identities. Every design choice involves trade-offs between competing values. The broader significance of cryptocurrency may lie not in replacing traditional money, but in demonstrating that money systems are choices rather than inevitabilities. For most of modern history, money has been whatever government said it was, with central banks managing supply and commercial banks creating money through lending. Cryptocurrency showed that alternative arrangements are technically possible. Whether those alternatives are superior depends on what you value: stability versus censorship resistance, consumer protection versus personal sovereignty, managed supply versus algorithmic rules. The cryptocurrency experiment forced people to think explicitly about these trade-offs rather than simply accepting the inherited monetary system as natural or inevitable. This consciousness about money's constructed nature would shape the next phase of monetary evolution, as traditional institutions adopted some cryptocurrency innovations while trying to maintain their control over the monetary system. As of 2026, multiple monetary systems coexist in an increasingly fragmented landscape. Traditional fiat currencies remain dominant for everyday transactions and are backed by governments and central banks. Cryptocurrency operates in parallel. It is used primarily as speculative investment, but also for certain cross-border transactions and in regions with unstable traditional currencies. Central bank digital currencies are being piloted or implemented in various countries, representing governments' attempts to modernize money while maintaining control. Private payment systems from companies like PayPal, Venmo, and various fintech applications create additional layers of digital money. Gold still functions as a store of value for those who distrust all forms of paper and digital currency. The question is not which system will win, but rather how these different forms of money will interact, and whether this fragmentation is sustainable or will eventually consolidate. Artificial intelligence is already deeply embedded in monetary systems, though its role remains largely invisible to most people. Algorithms determine credit scores, approve or deny loans, detect fraudulent transactions, set dynamic pricing, execute high-frequency trades, and manage investment portfolios. As AI capabilities advance, the involvement will deepen. AI systems might manage entire monetary policy, adjusting interest rates and money supply based on real-time economic data and predictive models. The Federal Reserve and other central banks already use sophisticated models to inform policy decisions. The progression toward AI-managed monetary policy seems almost inevitable, as the systems become more capable, and the economic data they can process becomes more comprehensive and immediate. Programmable money represents a frontier that combines central bank digital currencies with smart contract capabilities derived from cryptocurrency innovations. Money could come with built-in rules about how it can be spent. A government could distribute stimulus payments that expire if not spent within a certain time frame, ensuring the money stimulates immediate consumption rather than being saved. Benefits payments could be restricted to certain categories of purchases, preventing welfare money from being spent on restricted items. Tax obligations could be automatically deducted from transactions. The technical capability to create these restrictions already exists. The question is whether governments will implement such controls, and whether populations will accept money that comes with conditions on its use. The possibilities enabled by programmable money extend to corporate and institutional uses as well. A company could pay suppliers with money that can only be spent with certain vendors, creating closed payment loops. Insurance payouts could be programmed to automatically release when certain conditions are verified, eliminating claims processing delays. Escrow arrangements could be executed automatically by smart contracts without requiring trusted third parties. These applications would increase efficiency and reduce fraud in some cases, but they would also create new forms of control and surveillance. Every transaction would be potentially programmable, monitored, and restricted based on rules embedded in the money itself. Our universal basic income has moved from theoretical proposal to limited experimentation in various locations around the world. The premise is that governments would provide all citizens with regular unconditional cash payments sufficient to meet basic needs, funded through taxation, or possibly through capturing the productivity gains from automation and artificial intelligence. As AI and robotics advance, they may displace significant portions of the labor force from traditional employment. If machines can perform most productive work more efficiently than humans, the connection between labor and income that has existed throughout history could break down. Money might need to be distributed through mechanisms other than wages for work performed. The feasibility of universal basic income depends partly on how productive AI and automation become. If these technologies generate enormous increases in output with minimal human labor, then societies could potentially afford to provide comfortable living standards to all citizens through redistribution. The money would come from taxing the profits generated by automated systems or from capturing productivity gains through other mechanisms. However, this assumes societies can solve the political challenges of massive redistribution, and that people can find meaning and purpose outside of traditional employment. The psychological and social implications of severing the connection between work and income might be as significant as the economic implications. Post-scarcity economics, once relegated to science fiction, often enters serious discussion as AI capabilities advance. If artificial intelligence and robotics can eventually produce goods and services in such abundance that scarcity largely disappears, the entire economic logic that has governed human societies for thousands of years would need fundamental rethinking. Money exists because resources are scarce and must be allocated. If scarcity ends, what purpose does money serve? This scenario remains speculative and distant, but the trajectory of technology at least makes it a possibility worth considering. Some goods and services have already approached post-scarcity through digitization. The marginal cost of distributing software or digital media is essentially zero. If that pattern extends to physical goods through advanced manufacturing and energy abundance, the nature of economics itself would transform. Looking back across 5,000 years, certain patterns emerge that might suggest what comes next. Money has consistently moved toward greater abstraction, from physical commodities to metals to paper to digital entries. Control of money has oscillated between centralization and distribution, with long periods of centralized control punctuated by moments when that control fragments or is challenged. The fundamental problem money solves, enabling trust between strangers for exchange across time and space, remains constant even as the solutions change. Trust has been placed in kings, in precious metals, in banks, in governments, in mathematics and distributed consensus. Each solution works under certain conditions and fails under others. The future of money likely involves continued experimentation with different trust models, different forms of abstraction, different balances between privacy and transparency, between control and freedom, between stability and flexibility. The specific technologies will change, but the underlying questions about how humans coordinate economic activity, how value is represented and stored, and who decides what counts as money will persist. If the past 5,000 years teach anything, it is that money systems are human creations that change in response to changing needs and technologies, not eternal truths. Whatever money becomes in the next century or millennium will be something humans choose, deliberately or through the accumulated effect of countless individual choices, rather than something determined by nature or technological inevitability.